Sion, come on.
Sion. I heard. There's Elaine, but Sion's not there. Okay.
Hello, Elaine and Sion.
They're not there yet.
What is that?
Sion's coming, but I'm not ready for my close-up today.
Can I talk?
I'm gonna mute this. And then-
Mute ourselves.
Before we start and Martha begins her presentation, I just wanted to note that if you could mute yourself when the presentation starts, that would be great. Otherwise, I might mute you, sorry. So just letting everybody know. Thank you.
So after I leave.
We'll wait one more minute.
Wait till the time starts. Huh?
Yeah.
I turned out about this heavy, so hi y'all.
Yeah,
Hi, Olivia.
Hello.
lovely flowers at your house. Is that flower? Oh, no. It's a tank.
This is my aquarium.
Lovely fish tank at your house. You should switch to the palm tree, though.
I don't have. Jeff, I don't actually see the my option for streaming it or going live.
It's not popping up under more.
No.
Okay, well, we'll post it after. It's fine. Okay, I think we are ready to get started. So I'm going to pass it off to Martha.
Great, thank you very much, Steph, and hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for taking time to join us for this talk about the 1918 influenza epidemic. I'm Martha Berg, the archivist at Rove Shalom, and Steph and Olivia have been helping to get this meeting set up and are also providing technical assistance. So Steph mentioned to please mute your mic, but if you have a question or comment, please type it in the chat box and we'll have time at the end to address some questions. So I'm going to share my screen with you and show a slide presentation. There. Okay, this is the word that got me going on this whole research, unprecedented. It's that word, which I kept hearing over and over again, referring to our current lockdown because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Sorry, that's a phone I thought I had turned off. But that got me started with this research. And in my opinion, the word unprecedented is a real red flag for anyone interested in history. Our precedents, from plagues in the Middle Ages to a more recent pandemic only 100 years ago, one that touched the heart of community life in Pittsburgh. Yet we seemed to have no collective memory of it until very recently. But anyone with a willingness to dig into historical research and the time to do it, and a lot of us have that time right now, will find many parallels between Pittsburgh in 1918 and Pittsburgh in 2020. So just a note on terminology first. The 1918 flu epidemic is generally referred to as the Spanish flu, but I prefer to say just the 1918 flu pandemic or epidemic, following WHO guidance from 2015, when it cautioned against using place names for viruses, because often the real place of origin of the virus is not known, and geographic naming can lead to stigmatization of people from those areas. And I think we've seen that recently with COVID-19, when the use of Wuhan virus and Chinese coronavirus have led to incidents right here in the US of discrimination against Asian Americans. So I'm just sticking to the 1918 flu epidemic. And besides, some historians now believe that the very first cases of the so-called Spanish flu originated on a military base in Kansas. But no matter where this particular influenza virus began, its spread all over the world was facilitated by the military activities of World War I, which the US joined in April of 1917. By the summer of 1918, more than 2 million US soldiers had been shipped to Europe, and shiploads of wounded men were sent back home. So there was a lot of transatlantic traffic and opportunity for the virus to spread once it got going. And it did spread among the troops of all the combatant nations, and soon it spread to civilians as well, eventually resulting in at least 50 million deaths worldwide. But in order to keep up morale for the war effort, news of the flu epidemic was tacitly downplayed by politicians and journalists, which meant that almost no information was available to the general public until a deluge of flu cases hit their own cities. The advance of the flu was relentless, and ignorance due to underreporting no doubt cost many lives. The first cases in the US were reported in March of 1918, with major outbreaks in Boston and Philadelphia that September. Eventually, all cities and towns in the country had to deal with flu outbreaks, and they did it in different ways, just as we're seeing now with COVID-19. There are a lot of articles appearing now that provide general information about the 1918 pandemic. An excellent video source that I recommend is a film made about 10 years ago. It was recently re-aired on American Experience on PBS. It has some really interesting oral histories from survivors, and you can watch it anytime at home. Digging down into local sources, contemporaneous mainstream Pittsburgh newspapers show how the story developed day by day, really changing fast. You probably can't quite read the clipping on the left, so I'll read you a little part of it. It's from September 30th, 1918. And this quote is, "Pittsburgh has been passed up by the so-called Spanish influenza, but the danger of an epidemic is ever present, and every caution should be taken as a preventive," end quote. And the article goes on with recommendations for hand washing, avoiding large gatherings, and staying home when ill. And this may sound familiar to all of us now. But less than a week later, in the first week of October, Pittsburgh was under a state-mandated quarantine. On October 4th, the 1,400 saloons in Allegheny County and all theaters were ordered to close. Houses of worship were urged to restrict attendance for services, and large public meetings were canceled. Streetcars were ordered to keep their windows open and were disinfected every day, just like our buses now, our PAT buses. The first influenza cases and the first death in Pittsburgh were officially recorded during that first week of October, though almost certainly there were unrecognized influenza cases in September. Again, a parallel is that we just discovered that the earliest cases in the US were probably in January or even earlier. And many of the early cases occurred in the military training camps on the campuses of Pitt and Carnegie Tech. By mid-October, flu cases in Pittsburgh were being officially diagnosed at the rate of 600 per day. And this was certainly an undercount, since not all cases were reported. Pittsburgh Mayor Edward Vose Babcock considered support for the war to be his top priority, and he had led a war bond rally of 40,000 people at Forbes Field on September 29th, a day after the huge Liberty Loan Parade in Philadelphia that triggered that city's devastating flu outbreak. Public health was of little concern to Babcock. In fact, the director of the Board of Health he appointed was a political crony with no medical background at all. And so that lack of preparation left the city in the lurch when people began to get sick. And the mayor did not fully back statewide quarantine orders. It was a sort of a who's in charge here thing, and did not enforce them very stringently. And many businessmen and community leaders, particularly both Protestant ministers and bar owners, for very different reasons, pressured him to implement a speedy return to normal status. The most significant new piece of information to me was to learn that Pittsburgh had the highest per capita death rate of any city in the United States from the influenza epidemic. Pittsburgh's population in 1918 to 1919 was approximately 600,000 people. While it's difficult to gauge the actual death rate, estimates have placed it as high as 807 per 100,000 residents. Now, for the sake of comparison, the death rate from COVID-19 right now in New York State is 98 per 100,000, and in Pennsylvania, 13 per 100,000, according to today's CNN and Johns Hopkins statistics. In Pittsburgh, the total number of deaths was roughly 6,600, or over 1% of the city's population. This illustration from 1919, I really love this. It shows how our city's experience differed from other cities. It shows the number of excess deaths over the normal rate during the 7-week period of greatest prevalence in each of 7 large cities. Because the peaks occurred at different times in different cities, just as we're seeing today, the time periods reflected in the chart are not the same. The comparison is of the height of the incidence of flu. Pittsburgh is the second line, and it shows a very different trajectory from the highest one, a classic bell curve representing Philadelphia, and from the lower flattened curves of Denver and Milwaukee at the bottom. There are several reasons for this different shaped curve, from the mayor's less than enthusiastic regard for what wasn't yet called social distancing, to crowded, inadequate, and unclean housing for the thousands of industrial workers who were moving to the city, particularly for war preparation industrial endeavors. And undoubtedly, air pollution played a part. Our smoky city atmosphere, which continues today, though less visibly, set the backdrop for disaster. Inhaling large quantities of particulate pollution increases one's susceptibility to influenza, and many in Pittsburgh had been inhaling those particles for many years, resulting in an already unusually high death rate from pneumonia. That may be why, while the 1918 flu was known to be particularly hard on young adults overall, in Pittsburgh it killed older demographic groups in numbers disproportionate to what happened in other cities. In case you can't read it on the slide, this 1907 ditty goes, "Here's to grim Pittsburgh, the city of smoke, where the sky's but a memory and sunshine a joke, where the incense of stogies perfumeth the air, but in spite of her faults, we all love to be there." To find out how the 1918 influenza pandemic affected Pittsburgh Jewish community, I spent some time reading the Jewish Criterion. Because of the tacit press ban on full coverage, it wasn't particularly useful to search on terms such as influenza or epidemic until really after the worst of it was over. So I just sat down and read every page of every issue of the Criterion from September through December of 1918. Our online database of Pittsburgh Jewish newspapers makes it possible to do this reading from home, and I recommend you try it sometime. You can look up your ancestors, learn about Yiddish theater, see what was going on in Europe leading up to World War II, or just look at fashion ads or car ads over the years. There's something for everyone, I'd say. But during this 1918 period, the main issues I saw the most coverage of that fall were the war effort, of course, including an editorial headlined, "Keeping the Hun on the Run," and anti-Semitism and Zionism. Homefront coverage included a major push for the Fourth Liberty Bond campaign to raise funds for the war. What I did not see was any warnings about public health and safety or how people should behave when they're out or if they should go out at all, or any coverage of the citywide closures, except as they affected Jewish organizations. On October 4th, when the state health department banned large assemblies, synagogues and Jewish organizations suspended services and meetings, but without the benefits of live streaming, social media, and Zoom meetings that we have today. City Councilman Enoch Rowell, who was a member of Road of Shalom, demanded an absentee report from the city schools and discovered that the absentee rate was about 30 to 40%. And he argued that public schools should be closed, but that didn't happen until October 24th. And that may be another factor that influenced the spread of the disease here. Jewish organizations rallied to help wherever help was needed. The Pittsburgh office of the Jewish Welfare Board, operating out of the Concordia Club in Oakland, and coordinating community efforts to support Jewish soldiers at the training camps, had to shift to supporting sick soldiers. They lost their office, but continued their work when the Concordia Club became a convalescent hospital for flu victims among the soldiers who had been training at Camp Pitt. Some Road of Shalom Sisterhood members offered to do shopping for the recovering soldiers, and others made up comfort kits for the men. And though I saw that term comfort kits in several articles in the Criterion, I could not find out what was in a comfort kit. The Jewish Welfare Board supplied crates of oranges and grapefruits, and Sisterhood, Hebrew Ladies Hospital Aid, and the National Council of Jewish Women, Pittsburgh chapter, sent homemade jellies, pies, cakes, and eggnog. The visiting nurses of the Irene Kaufman Settlement House served residents of the Hill District, providing home visits and beds in their building for 1,047 cases of influenza and pneumonia in 42 days, an increase of 560% from their regular caseload. At that time, there was no organized citywide public health nursing program, so this was a great service to the whole community. Doctors and nurses at Montefiore Hospital worked around the clock during the epidemic, and the Gusky home took in newly orphaned children. Even when public meetings were banned, patriotic enthusiasm for the war effort did not wane. Richard Rao and other prominent businessmen in the Jewish community were designated as 4-minute men, meaning they were spokesmen for Liberty Bonds, committed to giving a 4-minute speech about war bonds at every opportunity. And the Road of Shalom Sisterhood, which had been given a quota of raising $250,000 for the Liberty Bond campaign, went over the top and brought in the astounding amount of more than $2 million. But by mid-October, subtler signs of the flu epidemic's effects on the Jewish community began to show up in obituaries of young adults between the ages of 16 and 40. Some give pneumonia as a cause of death or state that the person died suddenly after a brief illness. The one on the left there says an illness of 24 hours. Many of these young people left very young surviving children. Most of them died at home, and their funerals were held at home or at the graveside. These 3 obituaries, all from the same page of the October 11th issue of the Jewish Criterion, and all for people aged 18 to 30, represent deaths in Monessen, Squirrel Hill, and the North Side. Though the armistice ending fighting in World War I was signed on November 11th, 1918, giving the world something to celebrate, deaths in Pittsburgh from the flu continued on into May of the following year. Again, this is reflected on that graph, which shows a plateau, then a second sharp upward turn on Pittsburgh's line. Mayor Babcock lifted most social restrictions on Monday, November 3rd, against the orders of the state health commissioner, and not even a month after they had been put into place, but just in time, coincidentally, to use the reopened bars to gather votes for the very next day's election. In 1918, as in 1920, political factors sometimes outweighed public health concerns. But the state ban was soon lifted on November 9th, maybe too soon altogether, or perhaps an appropriate time for Philadelphia, where cases had already passed the peak. But even that date would have been too early for Pittsburgh, where people were still dying in the hundreds every day. An article in the Criterion for November 8th ended with a thought that might be expressed, though maybe in different words, today, and I will also end with this. Nor is the work completed. For many weeks after the epidemic has spent itself, there will be work of rehabilitation, of reconstruction to be done, to repair in a measure the havoc wrought. Thank you. I'm going to get off the sharing screen and see if we have some questions. I am not an expert on this topic, so if some of you are, we'd love to hear from you. Just type any questions you have into the box. I don't see any. Well, I was hoping for some good questions.
Well, I'll start. This is Rabbi Bisno.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for that. You may not be an expert, but you're as close as we've got. And I feel like I have a much better understanding, appreciation for what the precedent for this experience is.
Great, thank you.
I wonder if there were expressions that came out of this or efforts that came out of this that continued thereupon. I mean, the last quote suggests that it'll take some time even after the fact to repair things. But I wonder if there are elements from what was created then that endured beyond.
That's a really good question. I did not go farther in my daily reading of the criterion than the end of December 1918, except to read the Federation's annual report for 1918, which was published in April or May of 1919. And almost every single report for the different Jewish organizations in that overall report mentioned their work during the epidemic. So I think that could have been used as a basis for their funding.
Yeah.
Again, and I think the city overall may have realized as a result of the flu epidemic that it was a good idea to have some dedicated public health nursing and more attention to public health. The Red Cross played a really important part, and particularly they were pretty well organized in advance, and what they decided to take over in addition to nursing was funeral provisions. And they made an arrangement with the biggest funeral home in Pittsburgh to just supply a continuous supply of caskets, so that we didn't have in Pittsburgh the situation they had in Philadelphia, where there were piles of bodies in the streets and they were buried originally in mass graves dug with steam shovels. That didn't happen here. And also because our curve, though it was a funny shape, was, I mean, there were times when it was possible to keep up with the flow of new cases better than had happened in Philadelphia. But I don't really know about
Okay, no, thank you.
what the 20s were like. You know, were people thinking then, shall we make some provisions for the future? My impression is that because the end of the war and the flu epidemic happened at pretty much the same time, people wanted to celebrate the end of the war, and they wanted to forget that their cousin died or their grandmother died, or, you know, it was just easier to think of deaths in terms of military, people who died for a cause, rather than people who died just because they happened to be in the street and caught a bug. That's just my opinion.
Thank you.
So here's a question from Peter. I've heard that the second wave of the influenza was 10 times worse in terms of fatalities than the first wave. Do I know if that's true? I don't think it was 10 times, but I think in Pittsburgh particularly, the second wave was much stronger than it was in a lot of other cities. I don't know numbers for that.
Or what context can you give us sort of about nationally what followed as a result? Did public health change nationally? Did a federal response emerge at all? That
No, I think one thing I noticed, I read a number of general articles of, you know, good reputable sources on this, and I think that what's true now, what we're seeing now, of a state by state response, and even sometimes locality by locality, was also true then. And one reason for that is that the wave hit at different times in different cities. Different cities had more or less of a chance to prepare. They already had some infrastructure in place. Some did, some didn't. I didn't see any indication of any kind of federal response. There is a big project that was done at the University of Michigan. I forget who commissioned it or ordered it, but historians were employed to use their historical research skills on the 1918 flu epidemic to see what could be done in terms of public health overall. And that project was begun in 2005. And I heard a really good podcast about it. I can't exactly say where, but there is a book that came out of that research project, and it was definitely done by reputable historians. So,
Hi, Martha. Can I ask a question?
sure.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for putting this together. It's so
You're
nice
welcome.
to see you, and it's wonderful to see your work. I'm wondering if more was written up about the $250,000 goal that became over 2 million worth of bonds sold. How did they do that? That's really wonderful.
You know, it was really amazing. And the sisterhood later got some kind of a really special service flag from the president. That was early in 1919, because their reaching that amazing goal was just outstanding in the whole country. It was extremely unusual. And my impression from the little that was written about it in the newspaper, and when I can get back to the office, I'd be interested to look at the sisterhood board minutes to see if that's reported on. But really, I think it was word of mouth, and you know, there were a lot of affluent families who were members of Road of Shalom. And so if people were just able to tap their friends and families and neighbors, and it was, I think that especially that fourth Liberty Bond drive was really built up as a competition nationwide. And so that parade in Philadelphia, where there were 200,000 people, the mayor of Philadelphia was ecstatic that there were 200,000 people that would turn out for the war bond effort in Philadelphia. And then, you know, thousands of those people got the flu in a very short time. But so it was kind of set up as a, can you do better than Philadelphia? Can you bring in more money? So that the competitive effort was part of it too.
Okay, thank you.
So was there a second quarantine? Andy's question. There was not an official second quarantine, and even the statewide quarantine in 1918 was not a complete shutdown. Certain things were left to the cities and towns, like the state recommended that churches and other houses of worship restrict attendance, but it didn't say how, and it left it up to the local areas whether to do it or not. And in Pittsburgh, oddly, the Jews and the Catholics pretty much shut down right away, and the Protestants, somewhat perhaps like the evangelicals now, wanted to keep going. So they were the ones, they and the Liquor Association were the ones that were really putting pressure on the mayor to open up here again. But a lot of that was left up to the cities and towns, and there was no official second quarantine. So from Anne Malloy, do you find anything about the effects of the flu on children, both the immediate impact of the disease and the impacts on their education? That's a really good question. As I said, I didn't have, I mean, it'd be really fun to just sit and read these newspapers on into past the end of 1918, but I didn't really have time to do that. But I think one comment is that one of the reasons that the schools didn't shut down very early in Pittsburgh was that the superintendent of schools and the health department thought that monitoring of children, that the monitoring that was done in the public schools and the doctors that were on hand there provided a better, safer atmosphere for kids, so that there were doctors in every school, and they were rotating from school to school who were checking whether kids were appearing to be sick or not. And that turned out to be a little bit not helpful in the end, and maybe those doctors would have been better placed elsewhere from the very beginning. But the idea was to preserve education for the kids as long as they could. But when that, I mean, so many kids were not showing up, partly because some of them were sick, and some of their parents were sick, but some of their parents were just worried and didn't want to send them to school, so they were keeping them home. So those kids weren't getting an education during that time anyway. And I don't know about, because the shutdown of the schools was really quite short, I don't know if there were any remedial programs or anything like that. Sorry, I wish I had had time to do more looking into what happened as a result of this. So how and when did it end? It pretty much tapered off by April and May, and in Pittsburgh anyway, and I think tapered off much earlier in other cities that had a bigger spurt at the beginning. And then as flu epidemics do, it just, you know, sooner or later, it's just not a problem. And people build up immunities so that when it comes again, it was thought that the immunities that people built up from the 1918 flu kept us from having another big flu epidemic until the 1950s was the next one. I thought that was interesting. Okay. From Wendy, my father's sister was one of those who died at the age of 5 in 1918. I've read that now there is a major outbreak in the Hasidic community of New York City. Were there similar outbreaks in the Jewish community in 1928? I only know what I read in the Criterion, and during that period in the Criterion, there was not that much news from the Orthodox community that was published in the Criterion. Some, of course, but and when I looked at obituaries, I did not, make a list of how many were from which congregations. That would be interesting to know, but I don't know the answer to that. So from Ruth, what kept the economy from crashing during this time? Did the war effort keep it going? I think that the war effort is exactly what kept it going, particularly in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was a real powerhouse of war preparation. And that's why, that may be partly why we had such a big problem with the flu here, because people were moving to Pittsburgh by the thousands to come and work in the factories to put out that war material. So I think, and also it just wasn't, our shutdown right now is already longer than the shutdown was in 1918. That also surprised me to realize. But I think economically, it was the war effort that kept us from having a collapse. So the Jewish newspapers covered anti-Semitism. Was there any mention of Jews being blamed for the flu? I did not see any. I did not see any. I recently read an article about how Jews were blamed for the plague in Strasbourg in Germany in 1543, I think.
There's a long history of that.
Yeah, yeah.
Blood libels. And...
Right. Was there any public unhappiness with government actions? Yes, there was unhappiness on both sides. There was a feeling that, things shouldn't go back to normal, and a feeling that things should go back to normal yesterday. So that's exactly the same as what we're seeing today. I did read one article in the, not in the Criterion, but in one of the Pittsburgh papers, that said that the incidence of arrests for public drunkenness was drastically reduced during the time that the bars were closed. So a little side effect that nobody was expecting. So wants to know if a vaccine was developed after 1918. I do not think so. I do not think so. Does anyone know that? No. What subjects demand further research? From Eric. Eric, you need to start on this research right away. I think that question about how the different parts of the Jewish community experience the flu, whether they experience it the same or differently, would be a really interesting topic to study. What else? Well, some of the questions that have come up. Did the experience of the flu epidemic here cause different planning than would have happened before? That's a question we can look at for our future too. Will we plan things differently in the future? Eric, what do you think about, you can unmute and tell us what you think needs further work.
Hold on.
Hi.
Hi. So just as you were talking, I was thinking that it would be interesting to crowdsource all of the obits from that 5 or 6 month period with the date and the cause of death in the congregation to try and see. Like you, I've been kind of poking around to see like what exists out there. When I went into the minutes of Montefiore Hospital from that time period, it was literally nothing. There wasn't even minutes from September to January.
Interesting.
So we don't have a ton of congregational records from that time period, but I was thinking, and of course they're all in Yiddish, the ones that we do have. But I was thinking something along those lines. In terms of the impacts, I don't know, like aside from going through issue by issue and starting to get ideas on how to search for that stuff, it's hard to know. It does seem like the 20s were just such a boom time in the Jewish community.
Right.
It didn't seem to take that long to get to it, so.
Well, I can tell you one thing about obituary searching, because it was not very common at that time for any cause of death to be listed. And I think it was just beginning to happen, and maybe the flu precipitated that a little bit more. There were occasionally, as I said, someone would be said to have died of pneumonia, or this after a short illness or a sudden death. But there are very few other diseases that are ever listed at that time in any obituaries. So it would be hard to tell the cause of death. I was just making a lot of conjectures based on that sudden occurrence of death and the age of the people.
I know you don't have access to the archive right now, but do you think that Rabbi Goldenson talked about it at all in a theological way?
I doubt it. Rabbi Goldenson didn't come to Road of Shalom until the end of 1918, or maybe even the beginning of 1919. And I don't have any of his written work from before he came here.
And who was in charge during the interim between Levy's death and his arrival?
There were various pulpit-filling rabbis who came in and out. Several came more than once, but there wasn't anybody steady during that time.
That's interesting.
I want to know what's in those comfort care boxes. I do too. I couldn't find that. Well, I'm going to look in the sisterhood records when I get back and see. They may have mentioned, 2 candy bars, 1 pair of hand knit stockings. I have no idea. We'll find out maybe. Did the brief length of the shutdown extend the duration of the epidemic? People think so, same as now, but it's hard to find. As I said, I read as much as I could. There are a few academic articles that are really good. That University of Michigan project is really good. And in the podcast I heard, the interviewer asked the historian how they did their research, and I was happy to learn that he did it exactly the same way I did mine, which is to sit down and read, in their case, microfilm of article after article after article to find anything that had anything to do with the flu, because it wasn't so obvious. And there's one good article that does focus on Pittsburgh. It's about 10 years old, and it was written by a person who's a history professor, I think, at the University of Houston now, and I can't remember his name, but he expressed some strong opinions. He and I think somebody else I read were really pretty strongly of the opinion that the air pollution was a major factor here. And Pittsburgh had dirtier air than most other cities in the United States at that time. And in fact, we still have dirtier air than any place outside of California in terms of small particulate matter. So I think that may have contributed to the ongoing continuation of the incidence of cases here and to a higher death rate. Were there cancellations of activities such as symphony and sports events? Yes, there were. Any large assemblage of any kind was officially banned, and that was enforced more, excuse me, much more than the closing of bars. Apparently, a lot of bars whose owners or liquor suppliers were pals of the mayor, those bars somehow managed to stay open, or their door was closed, and if you did a special knock on the door, you got in, that kind of thing. But it'd be too obvious not to ban. I mean, if the state was banning large gatherings, pretty much Pittsburgh had to comply with that, and they did. I think there was no Pittsburgh Symphony at that time. It had started earlier and died out and started up again in 1926, I believe. So, anything else? No? Okay, well, it's great to see all of you. It's, yeah?
This was wonderful. Thank you, Martha.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Thank
I really
you,
enjoyed doing
Martha.
research, so, all right, good to see you all. Thanks.
Great methodology.
Thank you everyone for being here. Have a great day.
See you all soon.